Picture this. A small force of Roman soldiers stands at the edge of a vast battlefield, outnumbered 3-1. The enemy charges forward with thunderous war cries, certain of their victory. But within minutes, something impossible happens. The massive enemy army begins to crumble, not from superior numbers or better equipment, but from tactics so ingenious, so perfectly executed, that they seem almost like magic. This isn't fiction, this is history. And today, we're going to uncover the hidden battle tactics that made Rome the master of the ancient world. For over 8 centuries, Roman legions conquered territory spanning 3 continents. They defeated Celtic warriors, Germanic tribes, Greek phalanxes, Persian cavalry, and countless other enemies. But here's what most people don't realize. Rome's greatest victories weren't won through brute force or superior equipment. They were won through revolutionary tactics that were so advanced, so cleverly designed, that many of them remained military secrets for generations. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about ancient warfare. These weren't just battle strategies. They were psychological weapons, engineering marvels, and organizational masterpieces that turned ordinary men into an unstoppable war machine. Some of these tactics were so effective that they're still studied in military academies today. Others were so closely guarded that we're only now beginning to understand how they really worked. The story begins in the dusty training camps outside Rome, where young recruits learned not just how to fight, but how to think like a collective mind. It takes us through some of history's most incredible battles, where impossible odds were overcome through pure tactical brilliance. And it reveals how these innovations didn't just win wars, but fundamentally changed the nature of combat itself. But be warned, once you understand these secrets, you'll never look at Roman history the same way again. You'll start to see patterns that historians missed for centuries. You'll understand why Rome's enemies, even when they knew what was coming, still couldn't stop it. And you'll discover that the fall of Rome wasn't just the end of an empire, but the loss of military knowledge that took centuries to rediscover. So let's step back in time to an age when the fate of civilizations could be decided in a single afternoon, and where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to one simple question: who understood the art of war better? The year is 216 BCE. A Roman army of 86,000 soldiers faces Hannibal's forces at Cannae in southern Italy. The Romans have every advantage: superior numbers, better equipment, and the support of their homeland. They're confident, perhaps even arrogant. After all, they're Romans. They don't lose. But Hannibal has something the Romans don't expect: perfect knowledge of how Romans think, how they fight, and most importantly, how they can be beaten. In the space of a few hours, he destroys the largest army Rome has ever fielded. 50,000 Romans lie dead on the field. It's the worst military disaster in Roman history. Yet here's the remarkable thing. This devastating defeat becomes the catalyst for Rome's greatest military innovations. The survivors don't just learn from their mistakes, they revolutionize warfare itself. They take everything they thought they knew about combat and rebuild it from the ground up. What emerges is a military system so sophisticated, so adaptable, that it becomes virtually unstoppable. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades of trial and error, of studying not just their own failures, but the tactics of every enemy they encounter. Roman generals become students of war in a way no civilization had ever attempted before. They don't just want to win battles, they want to understand the very essence of what makes armies succeed or fail. This obsession with tactical perfection leads them to develop innovations that seem almost impossible for their time period.
They create communication systems that allow armies to coordinate across vast distances. They design formations that can adapt to any terrain, any enemy, any situation. They developed psychological warfare techniques that defeat enemies before the fighting even begins. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think of war not as a series of individual battles, but as a vast, interconnected system where every element supports every other element. Logistics, intelligence, engineering, psychology, politics, everything becomes part of the military equation. Let's start with something that seemed simple, but was actually revolutionary: the Roman legion's organizational structure. Most ancient armies were essentially armed mobs. Warriors fought as individuals or in small groups, relying on personal courage and martial skill. The Romans took a completely different approach. They divided their forces into precise, standardized units. A legion contained roughly 5,000 men, but these weren't just soldiers thrown together. They were organized into centuries of 80 men each, which were grouped into cohorts of 480 men, which formed the building blocks of the legion. Each unit had specific roles, specific training, and specific equipment. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just about organization for organization's sake. It was about creating a military machine that could think and adapt like a single organism, while maintaining the flexibility to respond to local conditions. Each century could operate independently if needed, but they could also combine their efforts in ways that multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. Think of it like this. Imagine if every soldier in your army was like a cell in a body. Each cell has its own function, but they all work together to create something far more powerful than the sum of their parts. That's what the Romans achieved with their legions. The training that went into creating this system was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Roman recruits didn't just learn to fight, they learned to move, think, and react as part of a coordinated whole. They practiced marching in perfect formation for hours every day until it became as natural as breathing. They learned to respond instantly to dozens of different trumpet signals, each one directing a specific tactical maneuver. But the real innovation was in how they approached combat itself. Most ancient armies relied on what military historians call the Great Clash. Two forces charging at each other and fighting until one side broke. The Romans developed something far more sophisticated, the manipular system. Instead of one solid line of soldiers, Roman legions fought in three distinct lines called hastati, principes, and triarii. The hastati, young and eager soldiers, formed the front line. Behind them stood the principes, experienced warriors in their prime. And behind them, the triarii, grizzled veterans who served as the ultimate reserve. This might sound straightforward, but the tactical implications were revolutionary. If the hastati encountered heavy resistance, they could fall back through gaps in the principes line, which would then move forward to continue the fight with fresh troops. If both lines were pressed, the triarii could advance while the other lines regrouped behind them. The result was an army that never truly got tired, never lost its organization, and could maintain pressure on the enemy for hours longer than any traditional force. Roman enemies often found themselves facing what seemed like an endlessly renewable wave of fresh, organized troops. But the manipular system was just the beginning. The Romans took this concept and applied it to every aspect of warfare. Their cavalry units used similar rotating tactics. Their light infantry, the velates, operated in coordinated swarms that could harass enemy formations before melting away and regrouping elsewhere. Even more importantly, Roman commanders learned to combine these different unit types in ways that created tactical synergies. Light infantry would provoke an enemy charge, drawing them into range of heavy infantry who had been positioned to maximize their impact. Cavalry would strike at precisely the moment when enemy formations were most vulnerable to disruption. This level of coordination required communication systems that were decades ahead of their time. Roman armies used a sophisticated network of trumpet calls, flag signals, and messenger systems that allowed commanders to direct their forces with unprecedented precision. A Roman general could literally choreograph a battle, moving thousands of men around the battlefield like pieces on a game board.
The psychological impact of this tactical sophistication was enormous. Enemy armies that had never encountered Roman-style warfare often found themselves completely overwhelmed, not by superior numbers or equipment, but by the sheer impossibility of predicting what the Romans would do next. Imagine you're a Celtic warrior facing your first Roman legion. You charge forward with your tribe, screaming war cries, confident in your individual skill and the support of your brothers. But instead of meeting you head-on, the Romans do something you've never seen before. Their front line engages you briefly, then suddenly melts away, revealing a fresh line of soldiers who attack from unexpected angles, while the first line regroups behind them. Before you can adapt to this new threat, Roman cavalry appears on your flank, not charging directly, but maneuvering to cut off your retreat, while light infantry pelts you with javelins from positions you didn't even know they occupied. Within minutes, your charge has become a chaotic mess, and you're fighting not one coherent battle, but dozens of small, separate fights, each one carefully designed to exploit your weaknesses. This is what made Roman tactics so devastatingly effective. They turned warfare from a test of courage to a science of force multiplication. Every Roman soldier was trained to maximize not just his own effectiveness, but the effectiveness of every other Roman soldier around him. But tactical organization was only part of the Roman military revolution. Equally important was their approach to logistics and engineering. While other armies lived off the land or relied on vulnerable supply trains, the Romans developed an integrated system that made their forces largely self-sufficient. Every Roman soldier was also an engineer. They carried not just weapons and armor, but tools for construction and earthwork. When a Roman army stopped for the night, they didn't just make camp. They built a temporary fortress, complete with walls, ditches, and defensive structures that could withstand a serious assault. This might seem like unnecessary work, but it served multiple strategic purposes. First, it gave Roman armies secure bases from which to operate, eliminating the fear of night attacks that plagued most ancient forces. Second, it provided excellent training in the engineering skills that Romans used to build siege works and battlefield fortifications. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it sent a powerful psychological message to enemies. These Romans aren't just passing through, they're here to stay. The Romans elevated field engineering to an art form. They could build bridges across major rivers in a matter of days. They could construct siege engines that could breach walls thought to be impregnable. They could create supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory and maintain them against constant harassment.
Consider the siege of Elysia in 52 BCE, where Julius Caesar faced the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix. Caesar found himself in an impossible situation. Vercingetorix had taken refuge in a hilltop fortress that was virtually impossible to assault directly, while a massive Gallic relief army was approaching to attack the Romans from behind. Caesar's solution was a masterpiece of military engineering that still amazes experts today. He built two complete sets of fortifications, an inner wall surrounding Alesia to prevent the defenders from escaping, and an outer wall protecting his own forces from the approaching relief army. In effect, he besieged a fortress while simultaneously creating a fortress to protect himself from a much larger enemy force. The construction project required moving thousands of tons of earth and timber, creating miles of walls, ditches, and obstacles, all while under constant attack from both sides. It should have been impossible. But Roman legions didn't just know how to fight, they knew how to build, and they completed the entire project in a matter of weeks. When the final battle came, Caesar's forces found themselves fighting enemies attacking from both directions simultaneously. But because of their engineering preparations, they could coordinate their defense perfectly, using their fortifications to channel enemy attacks into prepared killing zones while maintaining secure communication and supply lines throughout the battle. The result was total victory. Vercingetorix surrendered, Gaul was conquered, and Rome gained control of territory and resources that would fuel its expansion for centuries to come. But more than that, the siege of Alesia demonstrated something that would become a hallmark of Roman warfare: the ability to turn apparent disadvantages into overwhelming advantages through superior planning and execution. This engineering capability gave Roman armies a flexibility that their enemies couldn't match. They could fight in any terrain, under any conditions, against any type of enemy. Mountain warfare, naval combat, siege operations, desert campaigns. The Romans developed specialized techniques for all of them, and their soldiers were trained to execute these techniques with the same precision they brought to conventional battlefield tactics. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman military innovation was their intelligence system. While other armies relied on scouts and local informants, the Romans developed what was essentially the ancient world's first military intelligence network. They maintained detailed maps of every territory they might need to operate in. They kept extensive records of enemy tactics, strengths, and weaknesses. They cultivated networks of spies and informants that could provide real-time intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. Most importantly, they systematically studied and cataloged the military practices of every civilization they encountered.
This intelligence gathering wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. Romans didn't just want to know where enemy armies were positioned. They wanted to understand how enemy societies functioned, what motivated their leaders, what resources they depended on, and how they could be most effectively disrupted or co-opted. The result was that Roman generals often knew more about their enemies than the enemies knew about themselves. They could predict how enemy commanders would react to specific situations. They could identify and exploit weaknesses in enemy political structures. They could time their campaigns to coincide with harvest seasons, religious festivals, or internal conflicts that would minimize enemy effectiveness. This intelligence advantage was multiplied by the Romans' systematic approach to military education. Unlike most ancient societies, where military knowledge was passed down through informal apprenticeships or family traditions, the Romans developed formal systems for training officers and preserving tactical knowledge. Promising young men from wealthy families were sent to serve as tribunes with experienced legions, where they learned not just the practical aspects of command, but the theoretical principles underlying Roman military doctrine. They studied the campaigns of great generals,
analyzed successful and unsuccessful tactics, and learned to think about warfare as a complex system with predictable patterns and responses. This educational system meant that Roman military knowledge accumulated over generations instead of being lost when individual commanders died. Each generation of officers built on the innovations of their predecessors, constantly refining and improving Roman tactical doctrine. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. By the 1st century BCE, Roman armies possessed tactical knowledge that had been developed and tested over hundreds of campaigns against dozens of different types of enemies. They had institutional memory of what worked and what didn't in virtually every conceivable military situation. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. The Romans also developed systems for rapidly disseminating new tactical innovations throughout their armies. When a legion discovered an effective new technique, that information was quickly shared with other legions through formal reports and officer exchanges. When a commander developed a successful strategy, it became part of the standard curriculum for officer training. This organizational learning capability gave Roman armies an enormous advantage over enemies who relied on traditional methods that hadn't changed for generations. Romans could adapt and innovate in real time, while their opponents were locked into predictable patterns of behavior.
Consider how this worked in practice during Rome's conquest of Gaul. Caesar's legions encountered dozens of different tribal groups, each with its own fighting style, terrain preferences, and tactical traditions. Instead of trying to defeat each group using the same methods, Caesar adapted his tactics to exploit the specific weaknesses of each enemy. Against the Helvetii, who relied on massive tribal migrations, Caesar used mobility and logistics to force them to fight on his terms. Against the Germanic tribes, who favored individual combat and personal heroics, he used disciplined formations and coordinated attacks that neutralized their advantages. Against the Belgae, who were known for their fierce charges, he used field fortifications and layered defenses that broke up their attacks before they could achieve maximum impact. Each campaign taught Caesar's legions something new about warfare, and these lessons were immediately incorporated into their tactical repertoire. By the end of the Gallic Wars, Caesar's armies had become incredibly sophisticated, capable of adapting to any enemy or situation they might encounter. This adaptive capability was perhaps most dramatically demonstrated during Caesar's civil war against Pompey. Here were two Roman armies, both using the same basic tactical systems, both commanded by experienced generals who understood Roman military doctrine perfectly. The difference came down to which army could innovate and adapt more quickly than the other. Caesar won, but not through superior numbers or resources. He won because his legions had learned to think creatively about warfare, to see opportunities that more conventional commanders missed, and to execute complex tactical maneuvers that seemed impossible to outside observers. The Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar defeated Pompey's larger army, showcases Roman tactical sophistication at its peak. Caesar recognized that Pompey was relying on a massive cavalry advantage to win the battle, so he developed a counter-tactic that had never been used before. Instead of trying to match Pompey's cavalry with his own smaller force, Caesar created a fourth line of infantry specifically trained to fight cavalry. These soldiers used longer spears than normal infantry and were trained to target horses rather than riders. When Pompey's cavalry charged, expecting to overwhelm Caesar's weak cavalry and attack his infantry from behind, they instead ran into a prepared formation that neutralized their advantage and sent them fleeing from the battlefield. The psychological impact was devastating. Pompey's entire battle plan collapsed when his cavalry was routed, and his infantry, seeing their supposedly invincible cavalry in full retreat, lost confidence and began to waver. Within hours, Caesar had won a complete victory against superior numbers through pure tactical innovation.
But Roman tactical innovations went beyond conventional battlefield techniques. They also pioneered new approaches to siege warfare that revolutionized how cities could be attacked and defended.
Traditional siege tactics were relatively simple. Surround a city, cut off its supplies, and wait for the defenders to starve or surrender. This could take months or even years, and attacking armies often suffered more casualties from disease and supply problems than from actual combat. The Romans developed a completely different approach. Instead of passive sieges, they conducted active sieges that combined engineering, psychology, and tactical innovation to achieve rapid results. They built massive siege engines that could breach walls previously thought impregnable. They developed tunneling techniques that could undermine defensive structures. They created artillery that could accurately target specific sections of enemy fortifications. Most importantly, they learned to coordinate all these elements into integrated assault plans that overwhelmed defenders through sheer complexity and precision. The Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE demonstrates Roman siege tactics at their most sophisticated. The Roman commander Titus faced one of the strongest fortified cities in the ancient world, defended by fanatical Jewish rebels who were prepared to fight to the death. Instead of attempting a direct assault, Titus implemented a siege plan that combined multiple approaches simultaneously. His engineers built massive siege wall around the entire city, cutting off all supplies and escape routes. His artillery bombarded the walls continuously, focusing on specific weak points identified through careful reconnaissance. His miners tunneled under key defensive structures, while his assault troops prepared for coordinated attacks at multiple points. But the most innovative aspect of Titus's siege was psychological. He deliberately allowed some supplies to reach the city, but only enough to create conflict among the defenders about how resources should be distributed. He spread rumors about Roman clemency for those who surrendered, while simultaneously demonstrating Roman ruthlessness toward those who continued to resist. He timed his attacks to coincide with Jewish religious observances, maximizing the moral and spiritual pressure on the defenders. The result was that Jerusalem fell far more quickly than anyone thought possible. The city that should have withstood siege for years was captured in a matter of months, and the Jewish rebellion was crushed so completely that it didn't resurface for generations. This combination of engineering capability, tactical sophistication, and psychological warfare became the standard Roman approach to siege operations. They could reduce virtually any fortification, regardless of how strong it appeared, because they understood that successful sieges required more than just military force. Roman naval tactics underwent a similar revolution. When Rome first encountered Carthaginian sea power during the Punic Wars, Roman naval capabilities were primitive compared to their land forces.
Carthaginians had been masters of the sea for centuries, with superior ships, better trained crews, and tactical knowledge accumulated over generations of maritime warfare. The Romans could have tried to match Carthaginian naval expertise through gradual improvement and training. Instead, they did something typically Roman. They revolutionized naval warfare itself. They developed the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to fight sea battles as if they were land battles. This innovation neutralized Carthaginian advantages in seamanship and ship handling by turning naval combat into the kind of close-quarters fighting where Roman training and discipline gave them overwhelming advantages. But the corvus was just the beginning. Romans also pioneered new approaches to naval logistics, creating supply systems that could support large fleets across vast distances. They developed new ship designs optimized for their tactical innovations. They created naval intelligence networks that could track enemy fleet movements across the entire Mediterranean. Most importantly,
They learned to integrate naval operations with land campaigns in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of both. Roman fleets didn't just fight other fleets, they supported amphibious assaults, transported armies across hostile waters, and conducted raids that disrupted enemy supply lines and communications. By the end of the Punic Wars, Rome had transformed itself from a land power with minimal naval capabilities into the dominant maritime force in the Mediterranean. They achieved this not by copying existing naval practices, but by reimagining what naval warfare could be. This pattern of tactical innovation repeated itself in every theater where Roman armies operated. When they encountered new enemies with unfamiliar fighting styles, Romans didn't just adapt their existing tactics, they developed entirely new approaches that turned enemy strengths into weaknesses. Against Parthian heavy cavalry, Romans developed new formations and equipment that neutralized the effectiveness of mounted archers while maximizing the impact of Roman infantry discipline. Against Germanic tribal warfare, they created tactics that broke up the loose, individualistic fighting style that Germanic warriors preferred, while forcing them into the kind of organized combat where Roman training gave them decisive advantages. Against British chariot warfare, Romans developed countermeasures that neutralized the mobility and psychological impact of chariot war chariots, while exploiting the weakness of chariot-based armies in sustained combat. Against Armenian mountain warfare, they adapted their logistics and engineering to operate effectively in terrain that had previously been considered impassable for organized armies. Each new enemy taught the Romans something about the possibilities and limitations of warfare. Each campaign added new techniques to their tactical repertoire. Each victory demonstrated that military problems that seemed impossible could be solved through careful analysis, creative thinking, and disciplined execution. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman tactical innovation was how they learned from their defeats. Most ancient armies were demoralized by major losses and either disbanded or continued fighting using the same failed methods. Romans treated defeats as learning opportunities that could make them stronger. After the disaster at Cannae, Roman commanders studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. They analyzed every aspect of the battle, from the initial deployment to the final collapse of Roman resistance. They interviewed survivors, examined the terrain, and tried to understand exactly how Hannibal had achieved such a complete victory. But they didn't stop there. They experimented with counter-tactics that could neutralize Hannibal's advantages. They developed new training methods that would prevent Roman armies from falling into similar traps. They created new command structures that could maintain coordination even under extreme pressure. The result was that later Roman armies became virtually immune to Hannibalic tactics. When other commanders tried to use similar double envelopment strategies against Roman forces, they found that Romans had developed effective countermeasures that turned attempted envelopments into disasters for the attackers. This ability to learn from failure and convert weaknesses into strengths was perhaps Rome's greatest military innovation. It meant that Roman armies became stronger with each campaign, regardless of whether they won or lost individual battles. Every encounter with enemy forces provided information that could be used to develop better tactics for future engagements. The institutional memory system that Romans developed to preserve and transmit this tactical knowledge was unprecedented in the ancient world. They maintained detailed records of campaigns, battles, and tactical innovations that could be consulted by future generations of commanders. They created training programs that ensured new officers understood not just current doctrine, but the historical development of that doctrine and the principles underlying it. They also developed systems for testing new ideas before implementing them in actual combat. Roman armies conducted elaborate training exercises that simulated real battlefield conditions, allowing commanders to experiment with new formations and tactics without risking actual defeat. They held war games where different legions tested competing approaches to tactical problems, with the most effective solutions being adopted throughout the army.
This systematic approach to military innovation gave Roman armies capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. They could adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and defeat any opponent through what appeared to be pure tactical brilliance. But the reality was even more impressive than the appearance. Roman tactical superiority wasn't based on individual genius or lucky inspiration. It was the product of a military system that had been designed from the ground up to continuously improve its own effectiveness. The social and economic foundations that supported this military system were equally innovative. Roman military service wasn't just a job or a temporary obligation. It was a career that offered opportunities for advancement, wealth, and social status that were unavailable through civilian pursuits. Roman soldiers served for 25 years, long enough to develop genuine expertise in their profession. They received regular pay, bonuses for successful campaigns, and land grants upon retirement that made military service economically attractive even for citizens who had other options. This professionalization of military service meant that Roman armies were composed of genuine specialists who had devoted their lives to mastering the art of war. Unlike militia forces or tribal levies that might serve for a few months during campaigning season, Roman legions were full-time military units with the training and experience needed to execute sophisticated tactical maneuvers under combat conditions. The Roman military promotion system rewarded innovation and effectiveness rather than birth or political connections. Soldiers who demonstrated tactical creativity or leadership ability could advance to positions of significant responsibility, regardless of their social origins. This meritocratic approach ensured that Roman armies were led by officers who had proven their competence through actual performance rather than inherited status. The result was a military system that attracted the best talent available and provided them with incentives to develop their abilities to the fullest extent possible. Roman armies weren't just disciplined and well-equipped. They were led by officers who were genuinely expert in their profession and motivated to achieve excellence. The cultural impact of Roman military innovations extended far beyond the battlefield. Roman tactical doctrine influenced architecture, engineering, political organization, and social structure throughout the empire and beyond. Roman cities were designed using principles derived from military engineering. The grid pattern that characterizes Roman urban planning was originally developed for military camps, where it provided optimal organization for defensive purposes and efficient movement of troops and supplies.
Roman roads, aqueducts, and public buildings all incorporated engineering techniques that had been perfected through military construction projects. Roman political institutions reflected military organizational principles. The Roman Senate operated using procedures that were adapted from military command structures. Roman provincial administration was based on systems originally developed for governing conquered territories during active campaigns. Even Roman legal procedures incorporated concepts of discipline and systematic organization that had been proven effective in military contexts. The Roman educational system emphasized skills that were originally developed for military training. Roman rhetoric, with its emphasis on logical argument and persuasive presentation, was based on the communication skills that Roman officers needed to coordinate complex military operations. Roman engineering and mathematics curricula focused on practical problem-solving techniques that had been developed to solve military construction and logistics challenges. Perhaps most significantly, Roman military innovations influenced the development of political and social institutions throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Roman model of professional military service, merit-based advancement, and systematic tactical development was copied by numerous other civilizations, often with modifications that reflected local conditions and preferences. The Byzantine Empire maintained Roman military traditions for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, adapting Roman tactical doctrine to meet new challenges from Arab, Turkish, and other enemies. Medieval European military development was heavily influenced by Roman models, particularly in areas of siege warfare, fortification design, and military engineering. Even civilizations that never had direct contact with Roman armies were influenced by Roman military innovations through indirect transmission. Islamic military doctrine incorporated numerous Roman concepts that had been preserved and developed by Byzantine forces. Chinese military thought shows evidence of Roman influence transmitted through Central Asian trade routes and diplomatic contacts. The long-term historical impact of Roman military innovations is difficult to overestimate. They fundamentally changed how warfare was conceived, planned, and executed. They established principles of military organization, training, and tactics that remained influential for a millennium after the fall of Rome. But perhaps more importantly, they demonstrated that military effectiveness could be achieved through systematic analysis, continuous improvement, and institutional learning, rather than simply through individual heroism or superior equipment. This insight revolutionized not just military affairs, but approaches to complex problem-solving in numerous other fields.
The Roman model of combining practical experience with theoretical analysis, individual skill with institutional knowledge, and tactical flexibility with strategic consistency became a template for organizational effectiveness that extended far beyond military applications. Modern military institutions still study Roman tactical innovations, not just for their historical interest, but because they established principles of military effectiveness that remain relevant today. The Roman emphasis on training, discipline, adaptability, and systematic innovation continues to influence military education and doctrine in armies around the world. Corporate and institutional management theory has borrowed extensively from Roman military organizational principles. The Roman model of combining centralized strategic direction with decentralized tactical execution has become a standard approach to managing large, complex organizations operating in competitive environments. The Roman approach to technological innovation, which emphasized practical testing over theoretical speculation, has influenced modern approaches to product development and process improvement. The Roman integration of engineering capabilities with operational requirements has become a model for developing complex systems that must operate reliably under demanding conditions.
Even more broadly, the Roman example demonstrates the importance of systematic learning and institutional memory in achieving sustained excellence. Roman armies weren't superior because they were composed of superior individuals, but because they had developed superior systems for training, organizing, and continuously improving their collective capabilities. This insight has implications that extend far beyond military affairs. It suggests that human organizations can achieve extraordinary results through careful attention to systematic improvement, regardless of the individual talents of their members. It demonstrates that institutional knowledge can be more powerful than individual genius in solving complex, persistent problems. The Roman military system also illustrates the importance of integrating different types of knowledge and capabilities. Roman armies were effective not because they excelled in any single area, but because they successfully combined tactical skill, engineering capability, logistical competence, intelligence gathering, and psychological understanding into a unified system. This holistic approach to complex challenges has become increasingly relevant in modern contexts where problems often require interdisciplinary solutions. The Roman example suggests that sustainable competitive advantage comes not from excelling in isolated specialties, but from developing integrated capabilities that are difficult for competitors to replicate.
The fall of the Roman military system provides equally important lessons about the fragility of institutional excellence. Roman armies remained tactically superior to their enemies for centuries, but they eventually succumbed to problems that were political, economic, and social, rather than purely military. The Roman military system depended on a broader social and economic infrastructure that provided the resources, manpower, and institutional continuity necessary for sustained military excellence. When this broader system began to break down due to economic pressures, political instability, and social changes, even the most sophisticated tactics couldn't preserve Roman power. This pattern suggests that tactical innovation and military excellence, while important, are insufficient to guarantee long-term success without supporting institutions that can maintain the resources and organizational continuity necessary for sustained effectiveness. The barbarian invasions that eventually overwhelmed Roman defenses succeeded not because barbarian armies developed superior tactics, but because Roman institutional capacity had eroded to the point where Roman armies could no longer be maintained at their traditional levels of effectiveness. This decline wasn't sudden nor dramatic. It occurred gradually over several centuries as Roman political institutions became less effective at generating resources and maintaining discipline. Roman military units continued to use sophisticated tactics, but they had fewer soldiers, less equipment, and reduced logistical support compared to their predecessors. Eventually, quantity became quality, as barbarian armies, while individually less capable than Roman legions, could field larger forces more consistently than Romans could maintain their professional armies. The tactical superiority that had made Roman armies virtually invincible became irrelevant when they could no longer field forces large enough to control their territory effectively. The lesson here is that tactical innovation, while necessary for military success, must be supported by institutional capabilities that can sustain excellence over extended periods. Military effectiveness depends not just on battlefield performance, but on the broader social, economic, and political systems that provide the resources and organizational continuity necessary for sustained military operations. This insight has profound implications for understanding not just Roman history, but the rise and fall of military powers throughout history. It suggests that military decline often begins not on battlefields, but in the civilian institutions that support military effectiveness. Modern military forces face similar challenges in maintaining institutional excellence while adapting to changing strategic environments. The Roman example provides both positive models for innovation and cautionary examples of how institutional decay can undermine even the most sophisticated military capabilities. The study of Roman military tactics also reveals important insights about the relationship between technology and tactics. Roman armies achieved their extraordinary effectiveness not through superior weapons or equipment, but through superior organization and training that maximized the potential of relatively simple technologies.
Roman soldiers used essentially the same weapons and armor as their enemies. Swords, spears, shields, and protective gear made from materials available throughout the ancient world. The difference lay not in what Romans used, but in how they used it. Roman training emphasized not just individual skill with weapons, but coordinated team tactics that multiplied individual effectiveness. Roman equipment was designed not for individual performance, but for integration with unit-level tactics that required standardized, interchangeable components. This approach to technology and tactics has important implications for understanding how military innovation occurs. It suggests that tactical effectiveness often depends more on organizational innovation than on technological advancement, and that new technologies are most effective when they are integrated with organizational changes that maximize their potential impact. The Roman example also demonstrates the importance of systematic testing and evaluation in military innovation. Romans didn't just adopt new ideas because they seemed promising. They tested them extensively under realistic conditions before incorporating them into standard doctrine. This systematic approach to innovation helped Romans avoid the common military mistake of being seduced by technological novelties that provide impressive demonstrations but limited practical effectiveness. It ensured that Roman tactical doctrine remained grounded in proven capabilities rather than theoretical possibilities. The psychological aspects of Roman military tactics deserve special attention because they illustrate how sophisticated ancient warfare could be in its understanding of human behavior and motivation. Roman commanders understood that battles were won not just through physical force, but through psychological pressure that could cause enemy forces to lose cohesion and fighting effectiveness. They developed tactics specifically designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their own psychological vulnerabilities. Romans' emphasis on discipline and drill wasn't just about tactical coordination. It was about creating psychological resilience that would allow Roman soldiers to maintain effectiveness under extreme stress. Roman training methods were designed to simulate combat conditions as closely as possible, so that actual combat would seem familiar rather than terrifying to Roman troops.
Roman tactical formations were designed not just for fighting effectiveness, but for psychological impact on enemies and psychological support for Roman troops. The sight of Roman legions advancing in perfect formation, with gleaming armor and standards flying, was intended to intimidate enemies while inspiring confidence in Roman soldiers. Roman commanders also used information warfare and propaganda to weaken enemy morale before battles began. They spread rumors about Roman invincibility, circulated stories about the terrible fate awaiting those who opposed Rome, and used diplomatic contacts to sow discord among enemy coalitions. These psychological tactics were integrated with conventional military operations to create combined effects that were more powerful than either approach alone. Romans understood that winning battles required not just defeating enemy bodies, but breaking enemy will to resist. This sophisticated understanding of combat psychology
gave Roman armies significant advantages over enemies who focused primarily on physical aspects of warfare. It allowed Romans to achieve decisive victories even against numerically superior forces by causing enemy armies to lose cohesion and fighting spirit before physical combat reached critical stages. The Roman approach to military psychology has influenced military doctrine throughout history and continues to be studied by modern military psychologists and strategists. It demonstrates that successful military forces must understand not just how to apply physical force effectively, but how to influence human behavior and decision-making under extreme stress. The logistical innovations that supported Roman military operations were equally sophisticated and deserve recognition as major achievements in military science. Roman military logistics involved far more than just moving supplies from one place to another. It required coordinating the production, transportation, storage, and distribution of everything an army needed to maintain combat effectiveness: food, water, weapons, armor, tools, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and even luxury items that maintained morale during extended campaigns. The scale of Roman logistical operations was staggering. A single legion required approximately 2 tons of grain per day just for basic nutrition. Add in fodder for horses and pack animals, fuel for cooking and heating, materials for construction and repair, and all the other consumables that armies need to maintain combat effectiveness. The daily supply requirements for a major campaign could exceed hundreds of tons of material that had to be moved across potentially hostile territory.
Roman engineers solved this problem through innovations that wouldn't be matched until the industrial age. They built road networks that allowed supply convoys to move quickly and reliably across vast distances. They constructed way stations and supply depots that could support armies operating far from their home bases. They developed standardized equipment and components that simplified maintenance and repair in the field. But perhaps most importantly, they created organizational systems that could coordinate these complex supply operations with military movements and tactical requirements. Roman quartermasters didn't just manage supplies. They were tactical specialists who understood how logistical capabilities and limitations affected strategic and operational planning. This integration of logistics with tactics gave Roman commanders options that were simply unavailable to their enemies. They could conduct extended campaigns in regions where other armies would starve. They could maintain siege operations for months or years while keeping their forces at full effectiveness. They could coordinate multiple simultaneous operations across hundreds of miles because they had the logistics systems necessary to support such complex undertakings. The Roman road system, which is often admired for its engineering excellence, was fundamentally a military logistics network designed to support rapid movement of troops and supplies throughout the empire. These roads weren't just transportation infrastructure, they were strategic weapons that gave Rome decisive advantages in mobility and operational tempo. Roman roads were built to military specifications that prioritized reliability and speed over cost or convenience. They were designed to handle the heavy traffic of military convoys moving at maximum sustainable pace under all weather conditions. They included engineering features like drainage systems, foundation structures, and surface materials that ensured consistent performance regardless of environmental conditions. The strategic impact of this road network was enormous. Roman armies could move from one theater of operations to another far more quickly than their enemies could respond. They could concentrate forces at critical points faster than opponents could organize effective resistance.
They could maintain communication and coordination across vast distances that would have isolated other military forces. Roman commanders used this mobility advantage to achieve strategic surprise and operational initiative in campaign after campaign. They could appear where enemies didn't expect them, concentrate superior forces before enemies could react, and maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously because their logistic systems could support such complex operations. The medical and support systems that Romans developed for their armies were equally advanced. Roman military medicine was sophisticated enough to maintain army health and effectiveness during extended campaigns in hostile environments where disease often caused more casualties than combat.
Roman armies included trained medical personnel who understood not just trauma treatment, but preventive medicine that could minimize disease outbreaks. They established field hospitals that could provide surgical care under combat conditions. They developed sanitation procedures that prevented the epidemic diseases that regularly devastated other ancient armies. Roman understanding of military medicine extended beyond individual treatment to population health management. They knew how to select campsites that minimized disease risk. They understood the relationship between nutrition and combat effectiveness. They developed procedures for maintaining army health during siege operations and extended campaigns where traditional health risks were magnified. This medical sophistication allowed Roman armies to maintain effectiveness over longer periods and in more challenging environments than forces that relied on traditional approaches to military healthcare. It was another factor that contributed to Roman strategic flexibility and operational endurance. The intelligence systems that Romans developed to support their military operations were perhaps their most sophisticated innovation. Roman intelligence gathering went far beyond simple reconnaissance to encompass systematic collection and analysis of information about enemy capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Roman intelligence networks included not just military scouts, but diplomatic contacts, commercial agents, and local informants who could provide detailed information about political, economic, and social conditions throughout the regions where Roman armies might operate. This intelligence was collected systematically, analyzed carefully, and integrated into strategic and tactical planning processes. Roman commanders often possessed more accurate information about enemy territories than the enemies had themselves. They knew details about local geography, resources, political relationships, and military capabilities that allowed them to plan campaigns with extraordinary precision and effectiveness. This intelligence advantage was multiplied by Roman analytical capabilities. Romans didn't just collect information, they developed systematic methods for evaluating its reliability and significance. They maintained extensive records that allowed them to identify patterns and trends that might not be apparent from individual reports. The result was that Roman armies rarely faced genuine surprises. They usually knew what to expect from enemies and had prepared appropriate countermeasures before combat began. This predictive capability was a major factor in Roman tactical superiority and strategic success. Roman counterintelligence was equally sophisticated. They understood the importance of denying information to enemies and developed extensive security procedures designed to protect their own operational plans and capabilities. They also engaged in active deception operations designed to mislead enemies about Roman intentions and capabilities.
These information warfare capabilities gave Romans significant advantages in the psychological aspects of warfare.
They could manipulate enemy perceptions and decision-making processes while protecting their own forces from similar manipulation. The training systems that Romans developed to create and maintain their military effectiveness were revolutionary in their comprehensiveness and sophistication. Roman military training wasn't just about teaching soldiers how to fight. It was about creating a military culture that emphasized continuous improvement, tactical innovation, and institutional excellence. Roman recruits underwent months of intensive training that was designed to transform civilian volunteers into professional soldiers capable of executing complex tactical maneuvers under combat systems. But Roman training didn't stop when soldiers joined their units. Roman armies conducted continuous training exercises that maintained and improved soldiers' skills throughout their service careers. They held regular maneuvers that tested new tactics and procedures under realistic conditions. They maintained training standards that ensured consistent performance across all Roman military units. Roman officer training was equally comprehensive. Potential commanders were required to master not only tactical knowledge, but strategic thinking, logistical planning, engineering principles, and administrative procedures necessary for effective military leadership. They learned through a combination of formal instruction and practical experience that prepared them for the complex challenges of commanding Roman armies. This systematic approach to military education created institutional knowledge that accumulated over generations of Roman military service. Each generation of soldiers and commanders built on the expertise of their predecessors, continuously refining and improving Roman military doctrine. The result was a military system that became more effective over time rather than degrading through repetition and routine. Roman armies of the 1st century BCE were significantly more capable than those of the 3rd century BCE, not because of technological improvements, but because of accumulated tactical knowledge and organizational refinement. Roman military innovations also extended into areas that modern observers might not immediately recognize as tactical, but which had profound impacts on Roman battlefield effectiveness. Roman approaches to military leadership, for example, were sophisticated systems for maximizing the effectiveness of command and control under combat conditions.
Roman commanders were trained to think systematically about battlefield management, not just tactical inspiration. They learned to coordinate multiple simultaneous operations while maintaining situational awareness of overall battle development. They developed communication systems that allowed them to direct their forces precisely, even during the chaos of active combat. Roman command procedures emphasized delegation and initiative at subordinate levels, while maintaining overall coordination and strategic direction. This balance between centralized control and decentralized execution allowed Roman armies to respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining the coordinated effort necessary for complex tactical maneuvers. Roman leaders also understood the importance of morale and psychological factors in maintaining army effectiveness. They developed leadership styles that inspired confidence and maintained discipline even under extreme stress. They learned to balance the demands of military necessity with the human needs of soldiers who had to execute dangerous and difficult missions. The economic systems that supported Roman military operations were equally innovative. Roman military economics involved not just paying for armies, but creating economic incentives that supported recruitment, retention, and performance throughout the military system. Roman military service offered economic opportunities that were attractive to citizens throughout the empire. Military careers provided steady income, opportunities for advancement, and retirement benefits that made military service economically competitive with civilian alternatives. This economic attractiveness ensured that Roman armies could recruit high-quality personnel who chose military service as a preferred career rather than accepting it as an unavoidable obligation. Roman military economics also included systematic approaches to financing extended campaigns and maintaining military effectiveness during periods of economic stress. Romans understood that military capability required sustained economic support and developed fiscal systems that could provide necessary resources even during difficult economic periods. The economic integration of military and civilian systems allowed Romans to mobilize resources for military purposes far more effectively than societies where military and economic systems operated independently. Roman military success was built not just on tactical innovation, but on economic systems that could support sustained military excellence. As we near the end of our journey through the hidden world of Roman military innovation, it's worth reflecting on what made these achievements so remarkable. The Romans didn't just develop better ways to fight. They revolutionized the very concept of military effectiveness. They transformed warfare from a primarily individual activity based on personal courage and martial skill into a systematic discipline that could be taught, learned, and continuously improved.
They showed that military success depended not just on the quality of individual soldiers, but on the effectiveness of the systems that trained, organized, equipped, and supported those soldiers. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that military excellence wasn't a matter of chance or inspiration, but the result of careful analysis, systematic preparation, and continuous learning. Roman armies were superior not because Romans were naturally better warriors, but because they had developed superior methods for creating and maintaining military effectiveness. These insights had implications that extended far beyond military affairs. The Roman approach to organizational excellence, systematic innovation, and institutional learning became models for achievement in numerous other fields. The principles that made Roman armies effective were eventually applied to government administration, economic organization, engineering projects, and educational systems throughout the Roman world and beyond. The ultimate irony of Roman military innovation is that its very success contained the seeds of its eventual decline. Roman tactical superiority was so overwhelming that it eliminated most serious military challenges, which gradually reduced the pressure for continued innovation and improvement. Roman armies of the later empire were still technically superior to their opponents, but they had lost some of the adaptive capability and innovative spirit that had originally made them invincible. They became more conservative, more focused on preserving existing advantages than developing new capabilities. This institutional conservatism made Roman armies vulnerable to new types of challenges that couldn't be met through traditional approaches. Barbarian invasions succeeded not because barbarians developed superior tactics, but because they presented problems that required innovations that Roman armies were no longer capable of generating. The fall of the Roman military system illustrates an important lesson about institutional excellence. The capabilities that create success must be continuously renewed, or they will eventually become sources of weakness. Military superiority, like any other form of competitive advantage, requires constant innovation and adaptation to maintain effectiveness. But the legacy of Roman military innovation extends far beyond the historical period of Roman dominance. The principles that Romans developed for creating and maintaining military effectiveness continue to influence military thinking and organizational development throughout the modern world. Modern military academies still study Roman campaigns, not just for their historical interest, but because they illustrate timeless principles of military leadership, tactical coordination, and strategic thinking. Business schools analyze Roman organizational methods as examples of effective management and institutional development. Engineers study Roman construction techniques as demonstrations of practical problem-solving under resource constraints.
The Roman example continues to provide insights into how human organizations can achieve extraordinary results through systematic attention to excellence. It demonstrates that individual talent, while important, is less significant than institutional capabilities that can develop, focus, and sustain collective effort toward challenging objectives. Perhaps most importantly, the Roman military system illustrates the potential for human achievement when systematic thinking is combined with practical experience and institutional commitment to continuous improvement. Roman armies achieved results that seemed impossible to their contemporaries, not through magic or superior natural abilities, but through superior methods that maximized human potential. The story of Roman military innovation is ultimately a story about the power of systematic thinking and institutional excellence. It shows how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when they are organized, trained, and led according to principles that maximize collective effectiveness. These lessons remain relevant today because the fundamental challenges of coordination, motivation, and performance that Romans faced in military contexts are similar to challenges that modern organizations face in competitive environments. The specific techniques that Romans developed may be obsolete, but the principles underlying those techniques continue to provide valuable guidance for anyone seeking to understand how human organizations can achieve sustainable excellence.
That commitment to systematic excellence is perhaps the most valuable inheritance that Roman military innovation has left to future generations. It reminds us that human potential is limited not by natural constraints, but by the effectiveness of the methods we use to develop and apply our capabilities. The Romans showed that with the right approach, seemingly impossible goals can become achievable objectives. Their military innovations transformed not just how wars were fought, but how human organizations could think about the relationship between individual effort and collective achievement. In our modern world, where we face challenges that seem as daunting as those that confronted ancient civilizations, the Roman example provides both inspiration and practical guidance. It demonstrates that systematic thinking, institutional learning, and commitment to continuous improvement can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable through conventional approaches. The hidden Roman battle tactics that left everyone stunned weren't hidden because they were secret, but because they represented such a fundamental shift in thinking about warfare that their true significance wasn't immediately apparent. They established principles of organizational effectiveness that continue to provide valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand how human groups can achieve extraordinary results through coordinated effort. The story of Roman military innovation is ultimately a story about human potential and the power of systematic thinking to unlock that potential. It reminds us that the greatest achievements in human history have come not from individual genius alone, but from institutional systems that could develop, focus, and sustain collective effort toward ambitious objectives.
That lesson remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, when Roman legions first demonstrated that superior organization and training could overcome any obstacle. The tactics may have changed, but the underlying principles of excellence that made Rome master of the ancient world continue to offer valuable guidance for anyone seeking to understand how extraordinary results can be achieved through systematic commitment to continuous improvement and institutional learning.